From the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina, this is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, presented by A Cloud Guru, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We're coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. It's just Brian and I this week. Brian, how you doing?
I'm good, man. We are work is shut down for the year, so that's good, and finish up, do a couple of shows here, and kind of wrap up the year in style.
Yeah. So we, for those that have been following along at home for a number of years now, we tend to have a couple of end-of-year shows that we always do where it's just us, and we tend to do kind of a year-in-review wrap-up show, and then we tend to do a prediction show, and so this is going to be our kind of the biggest stories of the year and our thoughts on kind of where the industry has gone. But before we get into that, what's the latest on Krispy Kreme?
Yeah, so Krispy Kreme has been going very well. I think we're just shy of $1,500. So thank you to everybody who has made a donation to the Krispy Kreme challenge and the UNC Children's Hospital. For anybody who isn't aware of it or is interested in potentially making a donation, the simplest way to do it, there's two really easy ways to do it. If you go to thecloudcast.net, just go to our homepage. Up in the very top right, there's a picture of us having run the race. If you click on that, it'll take you right to the donations page. That's the simplest way to think about it or remember it. Otherwise, if you just want the URL, it is CrowdRise, CrowdWDRISE, crowdrise.com/thecloudcastnet. So it's like crowdrise.com and then our Twitter handle. So if you go there as well, it goes to the exact same page, and you can make a donation, $5, $10, $25, $50,000, whatever you want to give to help the kids would be great.
Yep. And just so everyone knows, all of the donations go directly to them. We don't get anything for just running and being stupid and eating donuts.
That's right. 100% goes to the kids, which is good. So the other thing, Aaron, today is, and I don't know when people are going to be listening to this, but today is Festivus. So do you have any grievances you want to air about, the show or just life in general before we get started?
No, I would say probably the biggest grievance I've had this year is, damn, it's been a busy year. So if anything, both an airing of a grievance and maybe a New Year's resolution all rolled into one here. My grievance and also resolution is to actually be on the show more next year. How's that?
That's good.
And that may be a good thing and maybe a bad thing. We'll find out.
Yeah, that's good. My grievance, when we talked earlier, like I was on a plane a lot this year. I went and got my annual physical, and I shrunk an inch. And I'm not sure if I was a little slouchy when they did it, but they gave me my number, and I was like, whoa, hold on a second. That's an inch shorter than I was last year. Like, what in the world? So my grievance is with the airline industry. Your planes are shrinking me, and I only have so much. I'm only so tall, so I don't need any shrinkage.
Yeah, well, and isn't that what happens to all the little old ladies too?
Basically, I'm now officially a little old man. I'm going to be, it's not good. I'm going to fit in the overhead bin sooner than later.
Yeah, well, maybe it's just your body's way of adapting to economy.
Yeah, that's right. I know the smaller planes are coming. So, all right, man. Well, listen, we said we decided we're going to do this show. We're going to do one more for the year. We decided this show we would look back at kind of the biggest. What we saw as probably the biggest stories or biggest trends of the year. Kind of go through them. What were they? Not so much as a rehash of them, but like, what do they mean? What do they mean to the industry? Were we surprised by them? Were we, do we think this is a huge thing for the next year, or was this a kind of a 1 year thing? So where do you want to start?
Why don't we start with containers? Okay. I'll just kind of throw it out there and go, it's been an interesting year for Docker.
Yeah, it definitely.
What's your thoughts on Docker, first of all? And I'll throw mine on top of it. But it's been a really interesting year for Docker.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that jumps out at me is last year we used to joke around a lot that we would say, every event was, sort of Docker, and Docker was a drinking game, it was a company, it was a technology. And this year, it didn't feel like it dominated the headlines nearly as much. At least Docker, the company, is the first thing that jumps out at me. Is it's sort of the technology's out there. Containers are a big deal, but the company sort of faded into the background a little bit. At least, my perception on it.
Yeah, and I would add too. So, it's your typical enthusiast curve of technology, it went really, really, really big, and then kind of, I wouldn't say went away, but certainly wasn't as big. But there's no way that momentum could have gone on the way it was. But what's interesting to me, though, is because I honestly don't follow the Docker space closely anymore like I used to. And so from afar, because I didn't go to DockerCon this year, and that was the first time I've missed in a long time. From afar, it almost seems like, yes, they've replaced the CEO. They've done a bunch of other changes. It almost seems like a pivot. And I know it's not, but it almost feels that way.
Yeah.
And it also, we've also wondered too. They've taken a ton of money. Where's the, follow the money trail? What's really going on there? I'm not saying bad things. I don't wish them bad things, but outside looking in, you just kind of scratching your head and going, what's really going on over there?
Right. Well, I think you hit on the biggest thing, which was they've taken a lot of money, and there hasn't necessarily been a super clear revenue stream. At least in terms of I want to say that they're around roughly $300 million they've taken in venture capital. And, they do have some amount of revenue. They have customers. They bring customers out on stage for DockerCon, but we're not seeing the $1 billion revenue streams that have sort of come through. But that in essence is, unfortunately, and we've had, we had Ben Golub on the show many times. That I think was sort of his demise, is they couldn't figure out how do you turn all this VC revenue and all this community hype into, a huge revenue stream, or I think they may have missed out on a couple of acquisition opportunities. There was talk of a $3 billion, $4 billion, Microsoft acquisition. They apparently, we don't have details, but apparently turned that down. And now they've got a new CEO who has not been very visible. He did seemed to do a few interviews right when he got announced. Has been almost non-visible at all ever since that happened. And then the other really big thing they did was and this was back, kind of the early part of the year when the US DockerCon happened, was they took the Docker project, the open source project, and basically said, you know what, we don't want anybody else to make money on the Docker brand, the name. So we're going to change that project name to Moby, and anything that's called Docker is now going to be our commercial stuff, and everything else that's community related and so forth is Moby, and a whole bunch of projects that sort of fall under Moby. And so they kind of put the community in a little bit of limbo. So that part has been, they had great community loved them. They put the community in limbo, and then they have a new CEO who has kind of, not really seen anymore, which is a very weird sort of state for them to be in.
Yeah, no kidding. Absolutely. So we'll be watching them certainly through 2018 and with a lot of interest, again, because, so many people have followed them. So many people have really loved their technology and what has gone on there. So, it's 2018, year in review won't be complete without, a follow-up on Docker, without a doubt.
Right.
And let's move on to Kubernetes.
Yeah, Kubernetes is essentially sort of the flip side of the Docker story. 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago, Google came out with this technology. We had some of the early folks on the show. We had Patrick Riley, we had Joseph Jacks on the show, and we were both kind of like, yeah, it seems cool because, obviously Google is unbelievably smart, great technology, but it's Google. Are we sure they're gonna follow through on it? Are we sure they're not going to pull out because they're bored with it or something? And this year basically became the year that not only did Kubernetes get adopted by everybody, but it has become sort of the de facto leader, if you will, in the container orchestration space and really kind of the container space.
Yeah. And what's really interesting too is think about this for a second. We've kind of broken this up and you can kind of see it in the show notes. We have different sections, right? We have container stuff, cloud stuff, infrastructure stuff. We're going to be talking about all of that. But I was just thinking about this as we were kicking this off. What's really interesting to me, though, is the influence Google is having outside of Google now. So there's a larger story here of, Kubernetes and Google. There is a larger story of Google Cloud and their integrations into, with other companies. And there's also, of course, for those that follow me in the day job, I'm following the hyper-converged space pretty tightly these days. And if you look at the big players in both hyper-converged and secondary storage, it's a lot of Google tech under the covers as well. And so, the Google for everyone aspect is actually coming to be more than people realize.
Yeah, it's definitely
when you really dig into, the next version of infrastructure or the next version of applications.
Yeah, it's definitely out there. It's sort of like, and I don't know if people would still remember this, but there used to be a company called BASF who would have these commercials that would say, we don't make the whatever. We don't make the fabric for your jacket. We make it better. Or we don't make the stuff that makes your skis go downhill faster. We make it better. Google is kind of becoming an ingredient in trying to make a lot of other things better. The question will become, is that a position they want to be in? Or do they want to be sort of front and center of what's going on? So I did think that there was sort of an interesting thing. So, on the Kubernetes front, and then we'll jump into two other things. We covered a lot of it. A lot of companies adopted Kubernetes. People like Docker sort of, stopped doing their own, well, they're still doing their own thing, but, they're adopting Kubernetes. Mesos is adopting Kubernetes. It was very interesting this year, though, in Austin a couple of weeks ago at KubeCon, is it suddenly went from, hey, Kubernetes is doing well, and, there's a few companies that are really leading it. It was Google and Red Hat and a few others, and then everybody jumped on board. And then the thing that sort of flipped, immediately flipped overnight, and this is the typical open source phenomenon. It was, Kubernetes is boring. It's a commodity. Don't worry about it anymore. Let's focus on something else. Literally, it was. Right. It had been adopted by everybody for 5 minutes, and then the open source community was like, bored. Let's move on. They're not interested anymore.
Everyone's here. This isn't cool. Exactly. I need to go find something else.
Right.
Let's go to Gedge now.
Exactly. So,
yeah. Well, there's a certain amount of folks that are both. They follow all the waves. It's how they make their living, following the waves. And the second something starts to become, it's not, and I wouldn't say Kubernetes is commodity, but starts to approach that wave towards commoditization, they're like, all right, I'm out.
Well, I jokingly say this, but it's sort of like the Kelsey Hightower effect. It's, I just need to be 5 minutes smarter than the room. And as soon as the room catches up to what I know, I got to move on to something else so that I can keep giving my talks at events and I can keep sounding like, okay, this is the new cool thing. So definitely, the Kubernetes space is definitely kind of exploding in that sense, and we'll see where it goes. So what's
by the way, that's a good thing.
Yeah,
I just
absolutely.
I think it's great that to see all of the adoption around it, and when you really do explore the tech, and everything just makes sense.
Yeah,
right. It sounds awful, but we've followed a lot of waves in tech, and some of them you're just like, wow, okay, that I don't know, the tech doesn't make sense, or there's other things behind the covers. When you really start to peel everything back, there's certain tech we've followed over the years. We're like, ooh, wow, yeah, that's not good.
Right. Yeah, no, I think we'll be following Kubernetes for a while. If for no other reason than it does a lot of things that are interesting for ops teams, and it does a lot of things that are going to be interesting for developer teams. So even if it skews one way or the other, it'll sort of fit in our domain for a long time. So listen, why don't we jump into sort of our second bucket of stuff, which was cloud stuff. Obviously we like to highlight where, every year we look back and go like, where are the three big clouds? Where do you see the three big clouds between AWS, Azure, and Google sort of at the end of 2017?
Well, so let me start also with something we talked about briefly the other day, and I thought this was a really interesting thing too. I think it's something we need to start tracking. So think about this, when virtualization was a wave, right? You start to get adoption, and you get more and more, and everyone's starting to grow more and more. And you did reach a point, and VMware was more than happy to point it out, where we got to a virtualization tipping point.
Yep.
Meaning more workloads, either new ones in development or existing ones, there's different tipping points, if you will, were virtualized than non-virtualized. When do we hit, and do we hit, a cloud tipping point where new workloads become public cloud default, or existing workloads start to move and have migrated, will we ever get to something like that where the majority of infrastructure is now in public cloud? And so that's something, a lot of folks are going to agree on. A lot of folks are going to disagree on. How do you measure it? When do you measure it? What kind of workloads? But we can say this has gone from a multi-millions industry to a multi-billions industry in a very short amount of time. And so you look at, Azure, it's getting bigger and bigger. And if you look at, if they include the Office 365 revenue, it's, $20 billion or so run rate business. That's impressive, right? In a decently short amount of time. AWS is 18 billion run rate. But, and Google Cloud, they're not really disclosing a whole lot yet. But it's obvious that they're growing as well. For me personally, the single biggest thing, though, is, yes, of course, there's a money trail to follow. But you look at the AWS conference. We were at the first one when it was, a couple thousand people tops.
Right.
And now it's 50,000-ish people in 5-6 years. It is just insane.
Yeah, it's almost like the conference has grown bigger than the platform itself at some point.
Yeah, and by the way, not that anyone at AWS listens to this podcast or has any, we're not influential in any way, shape, or form. But please, for the love of God, don't have it in Vegas again next year.
Yeah. Sorry. We're gonna have to have a whole show about tech conferences, because I think we are at a tipping point with them in terms of what they should be. No, you're right. I think you and I talked about this a couple of days ago. Kind of how do we start to figure out when is that tipping point happening? How do we measure it? I heard an interesting stat, and this is something that I think we and any of us who kind of come from either the what does Andy Jassy call it, the old guard IT world, or legacy vendors, or any of that sort of stuff. There was a stat that somebody had quoted that was from one of the analyst firm. It was like IDC or Forrester or something, and they basically said, they're projecting either in 2019 or 2020 that we'll hit that tipping point. But the way that we get to that tipping point isn't so much just, like AWS revenue or Azure revenue or something. It really is, you have to include, sort of the number of applications, and you get into SaaS, and SaaS becomes just an enormous part of it. And it is this weird thing, because the SaaS numbers are what drive it. So, somebody pitched me a couple of weeks ago. They were like, you wouldn't believe how much SaaS stuff there is. There's everything for, your regular stuff, your HR, your back office things, your Workdays, your Salesforces. They're like, but there are, SaaS applications for construction workers to do planning. There are, other SaaS applications to do, tracking of how much dirt is for construction, and for, there's an app for basically like every task and every function. And I think that may end up, being one of those things. And we've always said, we don't really know how to measure the SaaS market, because once you get past the top 8 or 10 companies, the Salesforces, the Workdays, some of the comms things like a Skype or something or whatever, it is so unbelievably fragmented and sort of long tail that it's hard to tell, what does that market really look like? But
well, and not just that, it becomes a little bit of the Russian nested doll philosophy of, there's a company that does a SaaS offering. Well, that company does this SaaS offering. Well, where are they going to host their infrastructure? Well, they're probably going to host it in one of the public clouds. And so, how do you measure that, but then also not double measure it?
Right. Well, and
so it gets really, really complex really quickly and gets really ugly. But I completely agree, because and again, I know I've mentioned this on the show before, but when I was working for SolidFire prior to our acquisition, this is years ago at this point, we never ran a single server internally. Everything we did, like you were talking about, Google Apps for everything, Office-y related, all of our HR, every payroll, everything was SaaS-based. And if we've talked about this, if we were ever go to a new company, we would never run a server.
Right. Well, we don't. We don't for the massive Cloudcast stuff either. But
right, that's right.
When we take our next huge round of funding, we'll make sure we don't buy any servers. But I think, look, as we close 2017, AWS is still, revenue and brand awareness, the big dog. Azure, I think we still feel like is the one that is definitely on the radar of people who care about enterprisey stuff because they know Microsoft. And I know I've heard from a lot of conversations this year where people are saying, I'm in a certain vertical industry and we don't trust AWS, right? Whether it's retail or a lot of different things. So I think that's going to drive some business. We've talked about that before. The other one it's going to be really interesting to me is, and I don't know where this will fit. Maybe this fits in a different category. We'll wait for it to come out. There's a provision in the new U.S. tax laws that are coming out that basically is this repatriation thing, right? So it's like forever large companies, the Ciscos and Oracles and Microsofts and whatever of the world have kept all this money overseas because, it was cheaper to keep it there than bring it back to the U.S. and tax it. There's a provision in this new tax law that I read briefly that says like you can get that one time, bring it back at 15% as opposed to say like 37% or something like that. So it'll be interesting to see if a ton of money comes back into the tech industry. And if that impacts, like literally hundreds of billions of dollars, does that impact kind of, the trend of these couple of big, cloud companies? And do we see a Cisco or an Oracle or somebody else kind of reinvigorate themselves?
Yeah, that's a good point. You want to move on?
Yeah. So let's move on to some of the infrastructure stuff because we've always said like some of the infrastructure stuff is boring. We try not to cover storage very much on this show. We don't cover things like VDI. We gave up on OpenStack 2 or 3 years ago. But there are some sort of new trends around infrastructure that I think are interesting and definitely worth following. What do you have on the top of your list for infrastructure? Because this is sort of your domain these days.
Yeah. So for me, the probably the biggest thing is you can almost think of this as there's a new blueprint emerging, a new architecture emerging. And what I mean by that is, okay, what is an infrastructure historically been? It's been servers, it's been storage, it's been networking, throw virtualization on top of it. And that's where we got, vBlocks and FlexPods and some of these other things that, both you and I were involved in way back when. But now we're starting to see the rise of hyper-converged infrastructure. We're seeing the rise of secondary storage. But what's more interesting to me isn't necessarily, hey, let's take a bunch of commodity components and smush them together. It's the underlying tech of it all. And that's why I mentioned earlier about, Google specifically. What we're seeing is a lot of these companies have Google tech, have people that have left Google or some of these other companies. And it's more about building these global distributed file systems under the cover, and then integrating them to a public cloud. And so you can almost think of it as it's completely different. It gets this job done, but in a completely different way.
Yep. And
then you're also seeing, we used to always, when we used to cover, hey, it was cloud native apps, it was 12-factor, this and that. But the infrastructure never matched. And so what we're starting to see is also this, it's almost like three different, in my head, I wish I had a whiteboard for it, but, three different pools, right? There's a virtualization, infrastructure, there's a container orchestration infrastructure, and then there's this secondary storage, which is kind of everything else. But they're all put together in an extremely different way to, achieve a more efficient result going forward.
Right.
And that seems to be where a lot of the growth and interest are. The way, I don't know, a lot of the new techs like Airbnb disrupting the hotel industry and Uber disrupting taxi industry. This seems to be the way the classic infrastructure industry is being disrupted.
Right. Yeah, no, I know we get a chance to talk to a lot of startups, or we get a lot of startups that get pitched to us. Hey, can we come on the show? And there's definitely a trend that's changed. So, back in the day in the networking space, somebody would say, "Oh, I used to be a such and such engineer at Cisco or Juniper or something," or we sold a company to EMC or NetApp back in the day. We're in the storage. We're going to do the new storage thing. And now more and more, whether it's companies in the infrastructure space or they're in monitoring or whatever, they'll say, "Yeah, our founders are ex Google, ex Facebook, ex distributed, specialized in distributed engineering, distributed computing, all the like the where the ideas are coming from, and then how do you apply them to enterprise problems are definitely shifting from people that have sort of solved them in big hard ways and are now trying to kind of miniaturize them to somewhat, or at least make them applicable to the other 99% of the world. To me that's very interesting. it's very interesting to kind of watch all of the HCI companies, kind of battle it out, which is again the kind of the new competitive front. It does feel a little bit like they're all chasing, sometimes quarters instead of dollars, because the amount that you pay for HCI stuff feels cheaper than it did for when you were buying servers individually and networks individually and big SANs individually and so forth. So, it's a little interesting to me when you hear folks be like, wow, we did $400 million in revenue. And you're like, you used to announce numbers that were like $4 billion in revenue or whatever. And
right.
So, I joked online, Chad Sakich, who we've known forever and is over at Dell EMC. Every year he does an end of year sort of wrap up, typical executive, hey, our company's great, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, well, yeah, you only had 1,500 words in your thing this year. It's really eating into the HCI business is really eating into your words and so forth. So it feels slimmer, which, it's what it's supposed to be. I mean, that was the original intention of all this converged stuff was, make it simpler to run, make it simpler to operate and converge some of those kinds of, put the function in the name and the title and so forth.
Yeah. And again, we've said it many times and we need to have him on again, go look at Simon Wardley's research and, on commoditization curves and, pioneers and settlers. And if you go look at all of that and you compare it to this model, all you're seeing is a maturation of the commodity curve. That's all you're seeing here.
Yep.
And it's going along. And don't get me wrong, he's not necessarily the first one to come up with it. I just feel like he does it in the most easily way to digest it. So let's move on to what does that mean for like VMware?
It's a great question. VMware's become an interesting company. Obviously, you kind of can't have an infrastructure destruction without VMware. Feels like VMware is no longer a virtualization company, which is, kind of hard to believe after a decade of, everything was virtualization. Every problem was a virtualization problem. They're a portfolio company now, right? They kind of finalized their big cloud play with AWS. So, what do they call it? VMware on AWS cloud. They talk a ton about NSX. They talk a ton about the mobile, I think it's called AirWatch, and they're trying to talk about containers now, and they're kind of doing it with Pivotal, and but they no longer talk about virtualization anymore, which is kind of strange, except in the concept of like, they've literally said like the virtualization stuff is so old and legacy, you should get out of your own data center and put it into AWS's business. Yeah.
And I think, I had posted this with being at VMworld this year and attending the keynotes. I thought it was hysterical that, and, very non-subtle that the first day keynote was Andy Jassy on stage with the AWS stuff. And then the day 2 keynote was Google Cloud with Sam Ramji on stage.
Right.
2 days, 2 big public clouds, 2 big announcements. And it was a little bit, you weren't going to put those on the same day and you weren't going to put them in the same keynote, but they split those over 2 days. But it also, it feels like VMware is playing multiple fronts. Mm-hmm. But it also feels like the public clouds, to a certain extent, some of them are picking their bets already, and some of them are playing multiples as well. So you can kind of come at it from the flip side of that, and you kind of say, okay, Azure obviously is Azure Stack, is their on-prem play, if you will.
Right.
It seems like AWS and VMware are pretty tight these days. Google Cloud seems a little fuzzy to me, though, and it sounds awful. And I'm going to, nicely pick on them for a second and go, this just feels so Google Cloud. They feel like they've maybe picked a couple potential partners, and the direction's a little muddy, and it just feels like so Google Cloud-ish at times. Like they've partnered with Nutanix, they've partnered with Cisco, they've partnered with VMware. So I think they're still figuring themselves out.
Yeah, and the other way I kind of look at it is, back in the day there was kind of this hierarchy of you had the vendors, and then the vendors would say, well, my way of getting to market is going to go through some channel partners or SIs or something, and so the vendors would say like, here's my direction, everybody needs to follow my direction, and then they would say, I need to find 10 partners that will all go off and push my thing, and they would try and tell the partners like, I want you to be loyal to what we do, and in essence, that's kind of what we're seeing this move up a level. So the cloud providers are now starting to say, okay, our vision, our architecture is the way you should do stuff. Only use our stuff, only come to one cloud, only take one approach to things, use this one technology. And then they're trying to, find a bunch of sort of channel partners, but in this case, they're vendors, to be the ones that push that out there to them. So there is sort of the hierarchy feels like it's sort of shifting up one level. And obviously the vendors are trying not to become channel partners because there's less money in being sort of a channel, distributor, fulfiller. And the cloud providers are trying to, kind of walk this fine line between, are you going to be locked completely into my cloud? Or, in the case of Google's trying to say, hey, we're the open cloud. So it will be very, very interesting to see kind of how that plays out. But it's definitely, the classic, like sort of lock you into my technology. Let me find as many distributors as I can possibly find model that we've seen in the past, just different names.
Yeah, completely. And I'll kind of move on here to the next one. I mean, which was an extremely hot topic for the year. I mean, there's even been conferences around it, and we even kind of spun off the podcast here a little bit around it, and that is the concept of serverless. In your mind, where does serverless fit into all of this, and what is kind of the year in review on serverless?
So, I think it's definitely going through a maturity phase, right? So it was, the first couple of years. Well, the first year or so was, I don't even know what that is, right? Like why do I need a Lambda? And then it became like, okay, there's a conference, and then of course we had the year or so plus of people going like, oh no, there's servers underneath it, which is sort of as dumb as it. To me, that's the equivalent of the people that like to correct you when you miscapitalize VMware. But it's like, okay, whatever makes you feel comfortable. And now we're starting to see kind of two trends come out of serverless. One is the wider sort of adoption. Like we're seeing more and more kind of use cases come out of it. We're seeing, more and more ways to connect it. And then we're also seeing, kind of the early adopters going, oh, there's a difference between serverless and functions as a service. And they're all trying to kind of thought leadership their way into, what does this mean and what doesn't it mean? I think serverless is doing fine. Obviously, AWS would love you to be doing everything in Lambda. And it is amazing how many like office of the CIOs or CTOs offices there will always be somebody, and I saw this, I heard this no less than a dozen times this year. Somebody would go, yeah, we want to move all our applications to Lambda, so you need to tell us why we shouldn't do that. And you're like, how much do you understand about the limitations of what this stuff does? Like, right. You're not, so it's definitely, rapidly climbing up the hype cycle. There are still some people doing really cool, interesting stuff with it. So it definitely doesn't fall in the, I'm not sure about this technology. But it's still in super, super early days, even though, some aspects of it, like the serverless conference stuff, are starting to become mature. It is still in super, super early days.
So Brian, one thing I'll add for anyone that wants to really get information about serverless or follow serverless, get in the serverless Slack channel.
Yep.
I'll have to dig up a link to it because I've been in it so long. I honestly don't even remember the address. But it is just an amazing group of folks. There is, constant communications back and forth. It is amazing what you can learn in it, but I completely admit too, like a lot of the conversations at times are above my head, but I'm trying to learn as much as I can. But if nothing else, one thing I've really learned in 2017 is, go figure out the roots of some of these communities. And I would say, at least for now, there is the serverless Slack channel, and it is kind of the core that I found of a serverless community and serverless education.
Yeah, it's probably the best place at this point to sort of go, hey, I want to cut through the buzz or the hype and figure out what's real. The only thing about the serverless community is I think it's still kind of primarily Lambda focused, although, like we said, there are a bunch of other services now that, can either tie into Lambda or do alternative things, which are good. Just at a high level, I know like at KubeCon, there were, no less than 4 or 5 different open source implementations that would run on top of Kubernetes. There's OpenWhisk. The Google, the Azure Functions team, is trying to have a good offering. Google doesn't seem to be anywhere, which is bizarre to me that they're kind of non-existent in this thing. But even if you're only kind of getting it from the Lambda perspective, I think the big thing to this is not to get hung up in the sort of like, what's my underlying framework for spinning up a function or a container or whatever. It's like, what's the new programming paradigm? And that's the stuff that really, if you're really into this stuff, will kind of differentiate you from something else.
Yeah, completely. Let's move on to stuff we don't understand. Yeah,
this could be a whole show.
I know. Yeah, we limited ourselves to two things today. So we've always been kind of an emerging tech podcast, but we admit it's been like infrastructure emerging tech or, some of these other things. There's so many things out there that is, the next things in emerging tech. And let's be completely honest with the infrastructure emerging tech. There's not that much there anymore. And so we've been kind of picking our head up recently and tried to, with a couple shows this year, to go into some new areas. And, some things we understand, some things we don't understand. But like, we just kind of came up with some quick topics here. What's your thoughts on Bitcoin, blockchain? Where's your head at with it? And more importantly, did you put any money in it?
So before we jump into that, so I did a quick sort of survey. Well, not survey. I just counted. I looked at the top like 200 tech podcasts for Apple. So, we periodically look and see where our show ends up. But I was looking. So there are like in the top 200, I think there's about, 5 or 6, maybe 7 that are infrastructure focused. So, folks like us or the Google Cloud Podcast or, DevOps Cafe or something like that. For Bitcoin and things that are like blockchain, cryptocurrency, there's probably 20 to 25. And then for things like machine learning and AI and so forth, there's another 20 to 25 that are in there. So, first off, there is a lot of hype around these things. There's obviously a lot of people that are trying to go, hey, I'm going to get involved with this space. But I was shocked that there was that many different things that somebody feels like, okay, there's a new unique perspective they can have on Bitcoin and blockchain. So that was sort of the first thing that really kind of surprised me the other day. The other one is, I've got a couple of friends who I think invest in this stuff. And boy, were they excited when it was 17,000 or 19,000 or whatever. I mean, literally a couple of weeks ago. And then I woke up yesterday morning and everybody was freaked out because it was down around like 2,000 or 3,000 or something like that. And then of course you get the, hey, it's a bubble. We all knew it was a bubble. Whereas 3 weeks ago, there were people going like, none of you understand economics. This is not a bubble. Don't worry about it. It is, it's a crazy space. I don't think most people understand the Bitcoin part of it. The blockchain part of it is different, but the Bitcoin part of it is insane right now.
Yeah. And so I had some interesting conversations. The last time I was out at Solid Fire headquarters out in Boulder, Colorado, I had some interesting conversations with some folks. I'm going to withhold all names and details, but it was interesting to me of they had invested in it and they gave me a lot of detail on it and why they were investing in it, and very much knew that this stuff is volatile, very much knew this stuff can crash at any second. But their thoughts on it were, even when it crashes, it tends to come back even more afterwards. Right. And so I was amazed at how in they were long-term, first of all. And second of all, I was amazed at how, and I just have never explored this, and this is where we need to get some folks on the podcast about this, how absolutely horrendously insecure the actual Bitcoins they are. So in the easiest way I have to use this is like, okay, you do the little Bitcoin mining, and this is, dummy Aaron view of it all. You do a little Bitcoin mining and out pops a Bitcoin. It's like $1 pops out, right? There, you don't have ownership of it than having physical ownership of it. It's not tied to you in any way. And, that money is then worth something. Well, guess what? Somebody can delete your Bitcoin the same way somebody can take your money. Somebody, if you lose it, right, the hard drive your Bitcoin was stored on goes bad, your money just went poof. And, people would storm in the equivalent of Bitcoin banks, and all the hackers go after those and either try and take those or delete them, or it's just like money. And the amount of insecurity around that, that's where the emerging tech probably needs to be. Yeah. Of how do you put some trust in the currencies once they pop out.
Right. Yeah. The only couple of things that because I've got like an economics background and the only couple of things that have jumped out at me as being sort of interesting is, I've heard a lot of security people tell stories and they say, look, you need to make sure that you understand how to have an account that has Bitcoin in it, because that's sort of the new currency of ransomware. So, if you get attacked by something, you can't write them a check. You can't they're going to hold you hostage for Bitcoins. And if you have no idea how to get Bitcoins or how to, pay for them, you're in a world of hurt. So that means, okay, IT, you have to figure that out somehow, or your treasury department or something has to figure that out. And then I think a couple of days ago, they actually announced on, I believe it was the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, which is a legitimate exchange. They do all of the futures and so forth. They announced like Bitcoin futures and a Bitcoin sort of marketplace for futures and stuff, so that you could bet. Because the thing has always been, it's easy to bet on things going up, but you also want to be able to bet on them going down, sort of like shorting a stock and so forth. So that emerged, I think, last week. And I think that's part of the reason some of this volatility has happened, because people can now see the other side of the bets and stuff. But here's the bottom line. You and I have no idea about what this stuff means. We have no idea how it works. And if somebody is really smart about this, or you're listening, or you have a friend, or, somebody, please let us know. We would love to get the most basics of stuff, just so we can be somewhat fluent, or, understand it a little bit.
Yep. Agreed. Let's move on to the last one. The show's probably going a little long.
That's okay. That's okay though. It's Christmas time, because people are driving in the car with their parents, so they need hours and hours of mindless babble.
Let's kind of wrap it up with this last one. Of our 10 big things. This is our 10th one. AI and machine learning. We've taken a crack at this one a couple times this year, and have some friends that have been on the show to kind of help us out along the way, but completely admit, and to your point, talk about a market that's saturated quickly.
Yeah.
Whether it's people supporting it, people actually doing it, startups and VC funding, wow, this one exploded.
Yeah. I feel like to a certain extent, and go back and listen to the show we had with Sam Charrington, and Sam runs an awesome podcast that talks about this all the time. So, that's a great starting source. And, folks like Derek Harris have been covering this for a long time. To me, and I'm interested in your opinion, to a certain extent, the sort of AI ML stuff feels a little bit like kind of the private cloud thing did 7 or 8 years ago, like literally when we first got started with the show, because on one hand, you've got awesome, amazing things happening in the public cloud, and the people that know how to do this stuff and are, embedding it in their technologies, do amazing things. And then the flip side of it is, you're now beginning to see every company and their brother that offers anything go, oh, it's got AI built in, right? And it's doing nothing more than just kind of giving you basic statistics and graphs, and they're calling that AI and so forth. And it's like, I don't think that's the same thing. I don't think it's what you mean to be talking about, but it's definitely reaching sort of an inflection point of, real tangibleness versus sort of massive hype. Just sort of include it because that makes it sound like you're cool.
Yeah. Well, and for me, the biggest thing is going to be, how does this get to mainstream? In the typical thing of okay, a curve of adoption of you go from enthusiasts to visionaries to, early majority, and all, you kind of go through this journey, right? AI and machine learning, and we've talked about this before, how is it going to move past that early entry into the market? Because it's either a steep learning curve of you need the right people, it's a steep learning curve of you need a big data pool. How do you make this consumable at scale?
Right. Yeah, and it's the same thing that people had when they were building websites, right? Oh, I have to handcraft the HTML, and then all of a sudden you had these tools that made it super easy for like the WordPresses of the world. And the other thing that's always interesting to me, the conversation teams always focus on two things. One is, AI and ML are going to get rid of jobs, which maybe, right? I think they're going to be a component of some of that. And then the one that was really interesting to me was people saying you're going to have a really hard time in the future believing anything, because the AI and ML stuff can make, can augment stuff in ways that, you have no idea if it's real or not. And the example they use like these pictures, and you can probably find it on the web somewhere. It was like picture of a cold, snowy road, and they sort of ran it through some sort of AI ML filter to say like, hey, nice, sunny, warm day. And they were like, this entirely new picture was generated just based on this model. And they're like, you have no idea that that's not the truth, that it's not warm and sunny because and I think that's going to be sort of interesting, especially given the sort of big political climate that we live in and fake news and what's real and not real. And those trends are going to be very interesting to watch.
Yeah. And for me, and obviously with the amount of podcasts and VC, like this is where the next big thing is headed.
Yeah.
Because it goes to what you were talking about, kind of an up leveling, all these trends we follow, they all go towards commoditization over time. But this one is more about just up leveling everyone's game. Right? Yeah. It is a little bit about, freeing everyone up to do more work or to do things more efficiently. And, this one will be extremely impactful, and I think is the next big trend over, the next 5 to 10 years. I think this is the next big trend in infrastructure. Yeah.
I think there's a lot of people that are like, you can't, if you're doing, say, microservices or you've got thousands of IoT devices, like you're never going to be able to manage them the same way you did with people and individual events, and you're going to have some sort of more smartness in there doing that, and AI and ML and honestly, like I'll be the first to say it. Like I don't know if I'm supposed to say AI and ML, or if like eventually we're all going to converge to it all being ML or AI, or I think just even like basic nomenclature needs to get cleaned up a little bit. And should we care? Do we have to care? Does it matter? I don't know.
Yeah, agreed.
Well, listen, we started off knowing what we were talking about. We're finishing being dumb, which is, I think, sort of par for the course for us. But there's a lot that happened this year. We went back and wrote it all down. It was a lot of big trends that happened this year.
A lot of big trends. But what's interesting to me is how different these trends are. Like, you go back and look at 7 years ago when we almost 7 years ago when we started all of this, right? The trends are completely different. Yep. But I would say this, these trends are exactly why we started the podcast however many years ago, of like, all right, there's a certain amount of things we kind of saw coming, you and I, in our day jobs. It just wasn't quite getting it done. And this was our way of kind of staying on top of all of this and quite frankly, sharing out what we learn. And this is just a continuation of all of that. So, in summary, I just wanted to say very quickly, thanks everyone again for continuing to listen. And, we're still amazed that folks are willing to listen to us every week.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And as always, and I think people are starting to feel more comfortable doing this, but like, send us your feedback, send us your questions, send us your comments, send us your ideas for shows and stuff. We're always looking for new stuff. And you folks that listen are obviously, curious about it. So if you've got interest, let us know. We would love to cover a lot of new topics. And like you said, Aaron, we've been on this 7-year kind of cycle. Some things have gone away and some things are emerging. So keep us up to date, folks. We want to have areas to go explore, and your input is always really useful. So you want to wrap us up and get us out of here?
Yeah, I would say, first of all, thanks for a fantastic 2017, everyone, and happy holidays to everyone and your families. And we will be back next week with our predictions show as well. So for those of you that like the guests, maybe, and you probably already fast forwarded past this one, you might want to fast forward past next week. But looking forward to an amazing 2018. And again, thank you everyone for listening, and we'll talk to everyone next week.
Thank you for listening to the Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more podcasts, show notes, and everything social media. And visit acloud.guru for all your cloud training needs.